My name is Amanda Callahan. I'm 33 years old. At my sister Caroline's wedding last October, my family publicly humiliated me in front of 156 guests. During dinner, my father stood up and said the true measure of a woman is the man she can keep, then looked directly at me, a single mother sitting at table 22. When Caroline grabbed the microphone for her speech, she called me unwanted by anyone, and the whole room laughed. Then my mother delivered the final blow. "She's a used product, honey. That's just how it works." The entire ballroom erupted in laughter, while I sat alone, about 15 meters from the stage, right next to the service entrance, like unwanted furniture left in the corner. They had no idea that the groom, Nathan Weston, had been quietly watching everything unfold. And they couldn't have imagined that just minutes later, when Nathan stepped up, took the microphone and spoke, his words would make my father's business partner drop her wineglass, make my mother go pale, and make my sister finally realize who I really am. That was the moment everything flipped, and my family learned the real cost of humiliating someone in public. But to understand how we got there, I need to take you back to where it all began. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday when I turned my 2018 Honda Civic onto I-40 East, heading home from another 12-hour shift at Hope Haven Shelter. The radio was playing something soft and forgettable. The highway was mostly empty except for a few long-haul truckers and late-shift workers like me. That night, we'd helped 3 women find emergency housing. One had been living in her car for 6 days with 2 children under 5. Another had arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and a black eye that was turning purple. The third had called our crisis line from a hospital parking lot, afraid to go home. Standard Tuesday night at Hope Haven. My daughter Lily was asleep at Mrs. Rodriguez's house 3 blocks from our apartment. She'd been staying there since 7 a.m. when I dropped her off before my shift. Lily was used to these long days, too used to them probably. That morning, as I'd been rushing around looking for her favorite stuffed elephant, she'd looked up at me with those serious 7-year-old eyes and asked, "Mommy, do you really help people?" I'd stopped searching for the elephant. "What do you mean, baby?" "At work. Do you really help people or do you just talk to them?" "I help them, Lily. I help them find safe places to stay and people who can keep them safe." She'd smiled then, that gap-toothed grin that made my chest tight with love. "You save the crying ladies, don't you?" 7 years old, and she understood my job better than my own family ever had. I was thinking about that conversation when my phone lit up at the red light on West End Avenue. Email notification. The sender was Caroline and the subject line made my stomach drop. Wedding seating update, final. I'd been dreading this email for weeks. I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot and sat in space 47B with the engine still running. My hands were steady as I opened Caroline's email, but my heart was beating faster than it should have been. The message was brief and copied to Janet Morrison, the wedding coordinator. "Janet, please move Amanda Callahan from table 8 to table 22. This is my final decision regarding the seating arrangement. She'll understand why this is necessary. Thank you. Caroline Callahan Weston, bride." The email was time-stamped September 28, 3:47 p.m. It was copied to me, which meant Caroline wanted me to see it. Wanted me to know exactly what she thought of me. Table 8 was the family table. I knew because I'd seen the preliminary seating chart 3 weeks ago, when Caroline had accidentally left it open on her laptop during Sunday dinner at our parents' house. Table 8 was where Lawrence and Patricia Callahan would sit, where Caroline's maid of honor would sit, where the important Callahan family members belonged. Table 22, I calculated quickly, would be in the back corner of the grand ballroom at Brentwood Country Club, near the kitchen service entrance, as far from the head table as physically possible while still being in the same room. I sat in my Honda Civic for 5 minutes, engine running, reading that email 3 times. Each time the words hit differently. She'll understand why this is necessary. Necessary. As if my presence at the family table would somehow contaminate the celebration. As if having a single mother sister would embarrass Caroline in front of her new in-laws. But what Caroline didn't realize was that this wasn't the first time I'd been moved to the back of the room. This was just the latest installment in a pattern that had been building for 16 years. My father, Lawrence Callahan, senior partner at Callahan and Associates, had been delivering the same philosophy for as long as I could remember. But it had become a weekly lecture, starting when I turned 17 and brought home my first serious boyfriend. Amanda, he'd said that night in 2008, sitting behind his mahogany desk in his home office. Let me tell you something important about life. The true measure of a woman is the man she can keep. He'd said it like he was sharing profound wisdom, like he was giving me the secret to female success. Look at your mother. She chose well. She chose a man who could provide, who had ambition, who came from good stock. That's why she's never had to worry about money or status or respect in this community. Caroline had been 18 then, already dating the son of a prominent Nashville family. Dad had approved wholeheartedly. Caroline understands this instinctively. She dates men with potential, men who will elevate her, men who add value to her life. Then he'd looked at me with disappointment that felt like a physical weight. You, on the other hand, seem drawn to boys with no future, no ambition, no family connections that matter. That conversation had set the tone for every relationship I'd have after that. Every boyfriend was evaluated by Lawrence Callahan's standards. Every breakup was analyzed through the lens of my failure to choose well. When I married David at 25, Lawrence had been cautiously optimistic. David worked in finance, wore suits, had an MBA from Vanderbilt. He looked like success, even if he didn't feel like love. When the marriage ended 4 years ago, Lawrence didn't ask why. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask about the bruises I'd covered with makeup for the last 6 months of the relationship. Or the nights David came home drunk and angry about his job, his life, his wife who couldn't seem to appreciate how hard he was working. Lawrence asked one question: "What did you do wrong?" For 4 years since my divorce, the family narrative about me had been consistent. Amanda was the daughter who couldn't make it work. Amanda was the cautionary tale. Amanda was proof that some women just don't understand how to keep a man happy. Caroline had refined this story over time, turning my failed marriage into evidence of my fundamental inadequacy as a woman. At family dinners, she'd reference my situation with casual cruelty wrapped in sisterly concern. "Poor Amanda just can't seem to figure it out," she'd say, cutting her perfectly prepared salmon. "Some women are natural wives, some aren't." My mother would nod along, not out of malice, but out of genuine belief. Patricia Callahan had married well in 1985 and built her identity around that choice. In her worldview, unmarried women were incomplete. Divorced women were damaged goods. Single mothers were cautionary tales. "It's not Amanda's fault," Patricia would say, with the kind of pity that felt worse than outright hostility. "Some people just aren't built for the kind of commitment marriage requires." They measured my worth by my relationship status, my income, my ability to present the right image at family events and social functions. I made $36,500 a year as a crisis counselor at Hope Haven Shelter. In their world, that wasn't just failure money, it was invisible money, charity work, something you did while you looked for a real career or a husband to support you properly. What they didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask about, was what that $36,500 actually bought. Last year alone, I'd handled 67 direct intervention cases, 67 women who had called our emergency hotline in crisis, women who'd been told they were worthless, used up, beyond help. Damaged goods, as my mother might say. These women called Hope Haven when they had nowhere else to turn, when their husbands had controlled every dollar and isolated them from every friend. When they were convinced that they deserved the violence because they weren't good enough wives, pretty enough women, compliant enough partners. I spent my days telling women they deserved better, that they weren't damaged, that they weren't used products. The irony wasn't lost on me that I went home every night to family dinners where I was treated exactly like the women I counseled during the day. But what my family didn't know, what they would never have thought to ask about, was that 3 months before Caroline's wedding, something had happened that would change everything. Something that had been documented, reported, and filed in quarterly reports sent to every major foundation that funded our work, including the foundation run by Caroline's future husband. July 15th, 2024, 2:18 a.m. I'd been asleep for exactly 43 minutes when my phone rang with the emergency hotline ringtone. It was a sound that could pull me from the deepest sleep to complete alertness in seconds. 5 years of crisis counseling had trained my nervous system to respond instantly to that particular combination of tones. I sat up in bed, grabbed my phone, and activated the recording system. Every crisis call was documented for quality assurance and legal protection. Hope Haven Crisis Line, this is Amanda. I'm here to listen. The voice that came through the phone was quiet, distant, and terrifyingly calm. I'm on the Shelby Street Bridge. I can't do this anymore. My blood went cold. Shelby Street Bridge. Every crisis counselor in Nashville knew that location. It was high enough, busy enough, and isolated enough at night to be one of the most common suicide attempt sites in Davidson County. Thank you for calling, ma'am. My name is Amanda, and I'm going to stay on the phone with you. You're not alone right now. Can you tell me your first name? Sarah. My name is Sarah, and I think I'm done. Sarah's voice carried the exhausted calm that I'd learned to recognize as immediate danger. Not hysteria, not anger, just the terrible peace that comes when someone has made a final decision. Sarah, I'm glad you called tonight. I'm glad I get to talk to you. Can you tell me what brought you to the bridge tonight? For the next 47 minutes, I talked to Sarah about her life, her children, her reasons for wanting to die, and her reasons for wanting to live. At minute 23, Metro Nashville police arrived on scene. At minute 35, their crisis negotiator arrived and tried to take over the call. Sarah refused. No, I want Amanda. Don't take Amanda away from me. So I stayed on the phone, sitting in my small bedroom in my pajamas, while police officers and emergency responders set up floodlights and safety equipment around the Shelby Street Bridge. I listened to Sarah tell me about her 3 children, her abusive ex-husband, her minimum wage job that barely covered rent, her exhaustion with fighting just to survive each day. I'm so tired, Amanda. I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of being poor. I'm tired of my kids seeing me cry. I understand, Sarah. It sounds like you've been carrying so much for so long. But I need you to know that your children need their mother. Not a perfect mother. Not a mother with money or the right house or the right job. They need you. At 2:45 a.m., Sarah asked me a question that would stay with me for months. Amanda, do you think some people are just broken, like permanently broken? I thought about my family dinners, my father's disappointment, my mother's pity, Caroline's casual cruelty, the way they looked at me like I was damaged goods. No, Sarah, I think some people are hurt. I think some people have been told lies about their worth for so long that they start believing those lies. But hurt isn't the same as broken. Hurt can heal. At 3:05 a.m., Sarah stepped back from the edge of the bridge. The police report would later document the exact time, the successful intervention, the transportation to Vanderbilt University Medical Center for evaluation and support. Sarah hugged the police officer who helped her down. Then she asked to speak to me one more time. Amanda, I don't know your last name or what you look like, but I want you to know that you saved my life tonight. Not just from jumping, you saved my life. 3 days later, I received a copy of the Metro Nashville Police Department Incident Report. Case number 24-157-0847. Crisis Intervention, Successful outcome. Responding counselor, A. Callahan, Hope Haven Shelter. That report went into our quarterly summary, which was sent to 12 major foundations across Tennessee, including the Weston Family Foundation. Nathan Weston read every quarterly report from every organization his foundation funded. It wasn't just due diligence, it was personal responsibility. The Weston Family Foundation distributed $4.2 million annually to crisis intervention, domestic violence prevention, and mental health support programs across Tennessee. Nathan took that responsibility seriously. He'd built the foundation after losing his sister to domestic violence 8 years earlier. Every dollar they granted, every program they funded, every life they touched mattered to him in a way that went beyond philanthropy. When the July quarterly report from Hope Haven Shelter crossed his desk in August, Nathan read it twice. The statistics were impressive. 218 women served, 89 direct crisis interventions, 100% successful outcome rate for suicide prevention calls. But it was the case study section that caught his attention, the bridge incident. Case number 24-157-0847. Crisis Counselor A. Callahan, 47-minute intervention, successful outcome. Nathan recognized that last name immediately. He'd been dating Caroline Callahan for 2 years. He knew about her family, successful father, socially connected mother, picture-perfect family dinners at the Callahan house every other Sunday. Caroline had mentioned her sister exactly once during those 2 years. It was 6 months into their relationship. Nathan had asked Caroline about her family, trying to understand the dynamics before meeting everyone officially. "Oh, there's Amanda," Caroline had said, waving her hand dismissively. "My older sister. But don't worry about her. She's not anyone important." Nathan had pressed for details. What did Amanda do? Where did she live? Would he meet her soon? Caroline's response had been practiced, like she'd refined this explanation over time. "Amanda's going through a rough patch. Divorce, single motherhood, works some kind of social work job that pays nothing. She makes everyone uncomfortable at family events. Dad's pretty disappointed in how she turned out." The phrase "not anyone important" had stuck with Nathan. It seemed like a harsh way to describe a family member, but he'd filed it away and hadn't thought about it again. Until he saw A. Callahan, credited with saving a woman's life on the Shelby Street Bridge. Nathan pulled out his phone and called Hope Haven Shelter directly. "I'm reviewing your quarterly report, the bridge intervention case. Can you tell me more about the counselor who handled that call?" The director, Maria Santos, had been effusive in her praise. "Amanda Callahan? She's our most experienced crisis counselor. 5 years with us, never lost anyone. The bridge case was extraordinary, but it's typical of Amanda's work. She has this ability to connect with women in crisis that I've never seen before." Nathan asked for Amanda's employee file. Education. Bachelor's degree in social work from Tennessee State University. Experience. 5 years crisis counseling, certified in suicide prevention, domestic violence advocacy, trauma-informed care. Salary, $36,500 annually. Current caseload, 67 direct interventions in the past year, all successful outcomes. Nathan sat in his office for 20 minutes, staring at Amanda Callahan's file, Caroline's sister, the one who was not anyone important, the one who made the family uncomfortable. This woman had talked a stranger off a bridge at 2:18 in the morning. She'd spent nearly an hour convincing someone to choose life over death. She'd saved Sarah's life with nothing but her voice and her training, and her willingness to answer the phone in the middle of the night. And Caroline thought she wasn't important. 2 weeks before the wedding, Nathan decided to ask Caroline directly about her sister. "Tell me about Amanda. What exactly does she do for work?" Caroline had been addressing wedding invitations at his kitchen table, her handwriting perfect and practiced. She'd looked up with mild annoyance at the interruption. "Crisis counselor or something like that. Basically social work. She makes almost nothing, helps nobody important. Why are you asking about Amanda?" Nathan had chosen his words carefully. I'm just trying to understand your family before we get married. It seems like Amanda's work might be meaningful. Caroline had laughed, not meanly but with genuine amusement. Meaningful? Nathan, she answers phones for women who make bad choices and need someone to blame it on. It's not like she's curing cancer or running a business. She talks to losers who can't manage their own lives. She'd gone back to addressing invitations. I love my sister, but let's be honest about what she is. She couldn't keep her own marriage together. She's raising a kid alone on poverty wages, and she spends her days with society's rejects. It's sad, really. Nathan had said nothing more, but he'd made a note to himself to look into Hope Haven's work more carefully, and he'd definitely decided he needed to meet Amanda Callahan before the wedding. I bought my dress at Target on a rainy Thursday afternoon in September, 3 weeks before Caroline's wedding. Navy blue, size 8, $89 on clearance. It was simple, modest, appropriate for a family event where I needed to blend into the background. The shoes came from Payless. Black pumps with a low heel, $45. I'd learned not to invest too much money in clothes for family events. I spent enough time sitting alone at back tables that it didn't matter whether my shoes cost $45 or $200. The total cost of my wedding outfit, $134. It was the most I could afford without touching Lily's college fund or dipping into the emergency money I kept hidden in a savings account that my family didn't know existed. That emergency fund had $847 in it, enough for first month's rent and security deposit if we needed to disappear quickly. I'd learned to keep escape money during my marriage to David. Old habits from crisis counseling die hard. The night before the wedding, I was hanging up my navy dress in our small bedroom when Lily appeared in the doorway in her purple pajamas. "Mommy, why don't Grandpa and Grandma and Aunt Caroline like us?" The question hit me like a physical blow. 7 years old, and she'd already figured out the family dynamics that I'd spent years trying to shield her from. I sat down on the edge of the bed and patted the space next to me. "What makes you think they don't like us, baby?" "We never get invited to things, and when we do go places, you're always sad afterward, and they never ask about my school or my friends or anything. Grandma asks Aunt Caroline about work and her boyfriend, but she never asks you about your work. Children see everything, remember everything, process everything in ways that adults forget they're capable of. Sometimes people don't understand what's important," I told her, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "They get confused about what matters and what doesn't. But you help people, that matters." "Yes, sweetheart, it does. The crying ladies need you." "They do." Lily was quiet for a moment, thinking with the serious concentration that 7-year-olds bring to big concepts. Maybe Grandpa and Grandma just don't know about the crying ladies. Maybe they didn't. Or maybe they didn't care. What I didn't know as I hung up my $89 dress and tucked Lily into bed was that Nathan Weston had already read about our work. He'd read about the 218 women we'd served that year. He'd read about Sarah on the bridge. He'd read about our 100% intervention success rate. And he'd already started making phone calls to people in Nashville who could verify what Hope Haven Shelter actually did, including Tennessee State Senator Elizabeth Marsh, who happened to be on the advisory board of the Weston Family Foundation, the woman who would be sitting at table 6 at Caroline's wedding, the woman who would approach me during cocktail hour with genuine interest in my work, the woman who would stand up and verify every word Nathan said when he took the microphone. But I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that Caroline had moved me from table 8 to table 22, and I was dreading spending another evening being reminded of my failures as a daughter, a sister, and a woman. What I definitely didn't know was that Caroline's casual dismissal of my work, "She helps nobody important," was about to be challenged in front of 156 guests by the man she'd just married. The grand ballroom at Brentwood Country Club looked exactly like the kind of place Caroline would choose for her wedding. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my annual salary hung from a coffered ceiling painted in ivory and gold. The walls were lined with oil paintings of men in hunting jackets who looked like they'd founded Nashville families in the 1800s. I arrived at 5:15 p.m., exactly 15 minutes after the invitation suggested, carrying a small gift bag that contained a crystal picture frame from Williams-Sonoma. $67 that I couldn't really afford, but that was the cheapest item on Caroline's registry that didn't seem insulting. The ceremony hadn't started yet, so I had time to find my table and get oriented to the space that would define my evening. Table 22 was exactly where I'd expected it to be, back left corner of the ballroom, positioned between the kitchen service entrance and a marble pillar that partially blocked the view of the head table. The tablecloth was the same ivory linen as every other table. The centerpiece was the same arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus. But the location sent a clear message about my place in the family hierarchy. I counted my steps from table 22 to the main stage where Caroline and Nathan would exchange vows. 43 steps across the marble floor, about 15.2 meters. Far enough that facial expressions would be hard to read, close enough that every word spoken into a microphone would carry clearly to the back of the room. I sat down in the chair that faced away from the kitchen doors, hoping to minimize the disruption from catering staff moving in and out during dinner. The other 7 chairs at table 22 would eventually be filled by distant family friends, business acquaintances of my father's, and what wedding planners call overflow guests, people who needed to be invited but didn't quite belong anywhere else. That's when I noticed Nathan at the head table, 43 steps away, watching me. He was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, his dark hair styled in a way that looked effortless, but definitely wasn't. Handsome in the way that men with money and confidence always seem to be, but it was his expression that caught my attention. He looked at table 22, looked at me sitting alone, then turned to Caroline and said something that made her glance back in my direction. Caroline's response was animated but brief. She gestured dismissively, said something that made Nathan's jaw tighten slightly, then turned her attention back to the guests approaching the head table. Nathan's eyes found me again across the ballroom. For just a moment, our gazes met. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement that felt strangely significant. I had no way of knowing that Nathan had just asked Caroline why her sister was sitting alone at a table in the back corner, and that Caroline had just told him not to worry about it because I preferred to keep to myself at family events. Both of those statements would prove to be significant later in the evening. The wedding ceremony lasted 32 minutes and was performed by Caroline's college roommate who had gotten ordained online specifically for this event. 156 guests filled the ballroom, arranged in neat rows facing a temporary altar decorated with white roses and ivy. I sat in the back row of ceremony seating, 3 chairs in from the center aisle, alone in the middle of a section meant for 8 people. My father's colleagues from Callahan and Associates filled the first 3 rows on the left side. 18 lawyers in expensive suits with their wives in designer dresses that cost more than I made in a month. The Weston family and their connections took up the first 4 rows on the right, men who looked like they belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, women who had the kind of polished elegance that money and breeding produced. I listened to the whispers around me as guests settled into their seats. That's Lawrence Callahan's other daughter, the one who had all the trouble. Divorced, right? Single mother now? Such a shame. Caroline turned out so well. Genetics are funny that way. Same parents, completely different outcomes. The woman behind me spoke a little louder than she probably intended. I heard she works at some kind of shelter, makes almost nothing. Lawrence is mortified. Her husband's response was quieter, but still audible. Well, you can't blame him. Imagine having to explain that at the country club. I kept my eyes forward and my expression neutral. 5 years of crisis counseling had taught me to absorb hostile environments without visible reaction. These people weren't my family, weren't my friends, weren't my community. Their opinions of me had no power unless I gave it to them. During the ceremony itself, I watched Nathan more than Caroline. While Caroline recited traditional vows about love and honor and commitment, Nathan kept glancing back toward the family section. When he realized I wasn't sitting with my parents and Caroline, his jaw tightened again. Caroline looked radiant in her $3,000 Vera Wang gown, her hair styled in an elaborate updo that had required a team of professionals and 3 hours that morning. She'd achieved everything our parents had taught us to want: successful career in public relations, wealthy husband with family connections, wedding that would be featured in the Nashville Society pages. I was genuinely happy for her. I was also keenly aware that her happiness was being built, in part, on my exclusion. The ceremony ended with a kiss, applause, and the kind of professional photographer activity that would produce an album worthy of Caroline's new social status. As guests moved from ceremony seating to cocktail hour, I found myself walking alone toward the bar setup, trying to blend into the elegant crowd while wearing my $89 Target dress and $45 Payless shoes. Cocktail hour lasted 90 minutes and was designed to give guests time to socialize while Caroline and Nathan disappeared for photographs. The bar was open, serving premium liquor and wine that probably cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a week. Waiters circulated with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked like small works of art. I spoke to 3 people during those 90 minutes. First, a server who asked if I wanted white wine or red. I chose white and thanked her politely. Second, a guest who mistook me for catering staff and asked where she could find the ladies' room. I directed her to the hallway near the entrance. Third, a woman who approached me with genuine interest and changed the entire trajectory of my evening. "You must be Caroline's sister," she said, extending her hand with the kind of firm handshake that suggested professional confidence. "I'm Elizabeth Marsh." Elizabeth appeared to be in her late 50s, with silver hair styled in a classic bob, and the kind of understated elegance that didn't need designer labels to announce its quality. She wore a charcoal gray dress that looked expensive without being flashy, pearl earrings that caught the light from the chandeliers, and carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in the room. "I feel like we've met before," she continued, studying my face with intelligent brown eyes. "Do you work in Nashville?" "I'm a crisis counselor at Hope Haven Shelter," I replied, expecting the polite but rapid subject change that usually followed when people heard about my job. Instead, Elizabeth's expression sharpened with what looked like recognition. "Hope Haven? That's very important work," she said, and her tone suggested she actually meant it. "Crisis intervention? Domestic violence support?" "Yes. Emergency hotline, safety planning, resource connection." Elizabeth nodded slowly, as if processing information she already possessed but was seeing in a new context. "Very important work," she repeated, then paused for a moment that felt significant. "The foundation community in Nashville pays close attention to organizations like Hope Haven." Before I could ask what she meant by that, Elizabeth excused herself to speak with other guests. But as she walked away, I caught her glancing back at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. It would be 3 hours before I understood why Elizabeth Marsh had looked at me like she was solving a puzzle. The rest of cocktail hour passed in predictable isolation. Other guests formed conversational clusters around shared social and professional connections, lawyers talking about cases, business executives discussing investments, society wives planning charity events that would generate good publicity and tax deductions. I stood near the edge of these conversations, close enough to hear, but not close enough to join. Occasionally, someone would make eye contact and smile politely before turning back to more relevant discussions. At 6:30 p.m., Caroline sent me a text from wherever she was taking photographs. "Please don't make a scene tonight. This is important for Nathan's family." I stared at that text for a full minute, wondering what kind of scene Caroline imagined I might make. I'd never made a scene at a family event. I'd never done anything at family events except sit quietly, eat dinner, and leave early. But the text told me everything I needed to know about Caroline's expectations for the evening. I was a potential problem to be managed, not a sister to be celebrated. I deleted the text without responding. At 7:15 p.m., guests were called to dinner. The ballroom had been transformed during cocktail hour. Round tables covered in ivory linen, place settings that included more silverware than most people used in a week, centerpieces that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. I walked past 21 tables filled with lawyers, executives, Caroline's sorority sisters from Vanderbilt, Nathan's prep school friends, family members who'd traveled from other states to celebrate the union of two successful Nashville families. Table 22 was exactly as isolated as I'd expected. The kitchen noise was constant, orders being called out in Spanish, plates clattering, the industrial dishwasher cycling through loads, the swing doors opening and closing every 30 seconds as waitstaff moved between the dining room and food preparation area. My table mates began arriving as I spread my napkin across my lap. Dr. and Mrs. Patterson, colleagues of my father's who'd known me since childhood but hadn't spoken to me directly in years. They nodded politely and immediately turned to each other for conversation. Jim and Sandy Morrison, family friends from Caroline's college days, who remembered me as the older sister, but couldn't quite place my current circumstances. Sandy asked how I was doing, listened to my two-sentence response about work, and Lily then moved on to asking Jim about their vacation plans. Margaret Sterling, senior partner at my father's law firm, who'd worked with Lawrence for 15 years and knew exactly who I was and why I was sitting at the table farthest from the family. She ordered wine and began discussing case law with Dr. Patterson as if I weren't there. By 7:25 p.m., all 8 seats at table 22 were filled, and I'd been effectively erased from the social dynamics despite being physically present. That's when the dinner program began, and I realized that Caroline had saved her most humiliating moments for when I'd be trapped at my back corner table with nowhere to retreat. At 7:30 p.m. exactly, Nathan stood up from the head table and asked for everyone's attention. The moment he started speaking, I knew this evening was about to become much worse than I'd anticipated. What I didn't know was that Nathan had spent cocktail hour asking questions about me. Questions about Hope Haven Shelter. Questions about the work crisis counselors actually did. Questions that had led to very interesting conversations with Elizabeth Marsh and other foundation representatives who happened to be among the 156 wedding guests. I was about to discover that while Caroline had been taking photographs and managing her perfect wedding timeline, Nathan had been getting educated about exactly who his new sister-in-law really was. And he'd decided that Caroline's version of my story needed some significant corrections. At 6:50 p.m. exactly, my father stood up from the head table, tapped his champagne glass with his silver knife, and asked for everyone's attention. The sound carried clearly across the marble floor, cutting through conversations and creating the kind of expectant silence that meant someone important was about to speak. Lawrence Callahan, at 62, was still an imposing figure. 6 feet tall, silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a charcoal suit that had been custom-tailored on Savile Row during a business trip to London. He commanded attention the way successful men did, through a combination of confidence, authority, and the knowledge that people listened when he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to addressing courtrooms and conference tables. "Before we begin our meal, I wanted to share some thoughts about marriage, success, and the choices that define our lives." He paused for effect, allowing the room to settle into complete attention. Waitstaff stopped serving. Conversation ceased. 156 guests turned toward the head table to hear what Lawrence Callahan had to say about love and commitment. "I've always told my daughters that the true measure of a woman is the man she can keep," Lawrence continued, his tone suggesting he was sharing profound wisdom accumulated over decades of observing human nature. Not her career achievements, not her education, not her independence, but her ability to choose well and maintain that choice through the challenges that life inevitably presents. Polite laughter rippled through the room. Wine glasses clinked in agreement. This was the kind of traditional sentiment that played well with Nashville society. Clear gender roles, established hierarchies, values that had worked for previous generations. "Marriage is not about passion," Lawrence said, warming to his theme, passion fades. Marriage is about partnership, strategic alliance, the wisdom to recognize quality and the discipline to maintain it. More approving murmurs from the audience. Caroline beamed at the head table. Nathan smiled politely, and the other women in the room nodded along with philosophy that reduced them to accessories to their husband's success. Caroline has proven this philosophy correct, Lawrence announced, gesturing toward his younger daughter with obvious pride. She found herself a man of substance, integrity, and achievement. She made the smart choice, the choice that creates stability, security, and social standing. The applause was warm, enthusiastic. Caroline raised her champagne glass to acknowledge her father's praise, while Nathan smiled the kind of smile that suggested good breeding and proper upbringing. Then Lawrence's expression shifted slightly, and his eyes found me at table 22. "Not everyone learns this lesson, of course," he said, his voice carrying a note of disappointment that felt like a physical blow across 15 meters of marble floor. "Some people prioritize the wrong things. Follow their hearts instead of their heads. Make choices based on emotion rather than logic." The silence stretched uncomfortably. A few guests glanced toward table 22, then quickly looked away. But Caroline understood what matters. She chose a partner who elevates her, who adds value to her life, who represents everything parents hope their children will achieve. Lawrence raised his champagne glass toward Caroline and Nathan. To Caroline, who proved that smart women make smart choices, and to Nathan, who was wise enough to recognize Caroline's worth. The room exploded in applause, glasses raised, smiles all around. A toast to Caroline's wisdom in choosing well, and Nathan's wisdom in choosing Caroline. I sat at table 22, next to the kitchen service entrance, applauding my sister's success while absorbing my father's public assessment of my failure. Margaret Sterling, sitting 3 seats away from me, caught my eye and offered a sympathetic smile that somehow made the humiliation worse. Caroline took the microphone from Nathan with the kind of practiced grace that suggested she'd been planning this moment for months. She looked radiant in her Vera Wang gown, her professional training in public relations evident in the way she commanded attention without seeming to effort. "Thank you, Daddy," she began, her voice warm with affection and amplified clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "And thank you all for being here to celebrate the happiest day of my life." Polite applause, expectant smiles, the kind of atmosphere that suggested everyone was prepared to enjoy whatever heartwarming sentiments the bride wanted to share. Caroline began with gratitude, thanking guests for traveling, praising Nathan's family for welcoming her, acknowledging the vendors who'd made the evening possible, standard wedding speech material delivered with professional polish. Then she shifted gears. "I have to share something that's been on my mind tonight," Caroline said, her tone becoming more conversational, more intimate. "Family is complicated, isn't it? We love each other, but we also drive each other crazy in ways that only family can." Knowing laughter from the audience. Everyone had family dynamics they could relate to. "My sister Amanda is here tonight," Caroline continued, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the room without actually looking at table 22. "She's sitting back there somewhere, probably wondering why I'm embarrassing her in front of all these nice people." More laughter, louder this time. The audience was enjoying this glimpse into sisterly dynamics. "Amanda is a single mother," Caroline said, her tone suggesting this was both explanation and apology. Well, let's just say she's been unwanted by anyone significant for quite some time now. But hey, that's family, right? We love them anyway." The laughter that followed was different, more uncomfortable, edged with the kind of cruelty that passed for humor in certain social circles. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as 156 people laughed at my relationship status, my motherhood, my apparent inability to attract anyone significant. Caroline wasn't finished. "In a lot of ways, Amanda taught me what not to do in relationships," she continued, building momentum. "She showed me the importance of choosing wisely, of prioritizing stability over passion, of understanding what successful women know instinctively." The audience was fully engaged now, enjoying Caroline's honest assessment of family dysfunction. So in a weird way, I owe my successful marriage to Amanda's example, Caroline concluded, raising her champagne glass toward table 22. Thank you, sister, for showing me how to keep a man happy, how to choose someone worthy, how to build something that lasts. The applause was thunderous. Caroline beamed with the satisfaction of someone who'd just delivered exactly the message she'd intended. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, face burning with humiliation, while 156 people celebrated my sister's wisdom in learning from my failures. But the worst was yet to come. As Caroline handed the microphone back to Nathan, my mother Patricia stood up at the head table. She didn't need the microphone to make herself heard. Patricia Callahan had spent 30 years in Nashville society learning how to project her voice across rooms filled with important people. "She's a used product, honey," Patricia said to Caroline, her words carrying clearly across the marble floor. "That's just how it works." Her tone was matter-of-fact, clinical, not angry or cruel, but stated with the kind of certainty that suggested she was sharing an obvious truth that everyone in the room already understood. Patricia's voice carried the same tone she used when explaining why certain restaurants were inappropriate for business dinners, or why certain neighborhoods weren't suitable for raising children, or why certain people couldn't be trusted with important social responsibilities. "Some women understand how to maintain their value," Patricia continued, sitting back down but still speaking loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Some don't. It's not personal. It's just reality." The laughter that followed was uncomfortable now. Guests shifted in their seats, sensing that we'd crossed a line from playful family teasing into something darker and more cruel. Margaret Sterling stopped smiling. Dr. Patterson looked down at his plate. Sandy Morrison whispered something urgent to her husband. But the damage was done. My mother had just called her own daughter a used product, in front of 156 guests, at my sister's wedding, with the same casual certainty she might use to comment on the weather or the quality of the catering. I sat perfectly still at table 22, next to the kitchen service entrance, feeling the eyes of every guest in the ballroom land on me with a mixture of pity, embarrassment, and voyeuristic fascination. Nathan Weston set down his napkin with deliberate care. His jaw was tight. His expression had shifted from polite amusement to something much harder. He stood up slowly, adjusted his jacket, and walked the 12 steps to the microphone, with the kind of measured pace that suggested he had something important to say. The room fell completely silent as Nathan approached the podium. Even the kitchen noise seemed to quiet in anticipation. He adjusted the microphone to his height, looked out at the 156 guests, then spoke in the clear, calm voice of someone who just decided to set the record straight. "I have something important to say about Amanda Callahan." Every head in the room turned toward table 22. I felt the weight of their collective attention like a physical pressure. The room was about to change in ways that none of us, except Nathan, could have anticipated. Nathan Weston stood behind the microphone with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise its voice to command attention. At 6'2", in his perfectly tailored navy suit, he looked like exactly what he was: a man accustomed to boardrooms, important decisions, and being listened to when he spoke. The ballroom fell completely silent. Even the kitchen staff seemed to sense that something significant was happening, because the usual clatter of dishes and preparation noise stopped entirely. "Thank you, Caroline, for those interesting observations about your sister," Nathan began, his tone carefully neutral, but carrying an undertone that suggested he had thoughts of his own to share. "I appreciate the opportunity to address some misconceptions." Caroline's smile flickered slightly. This wasn't part of the planned program. "Before I continue, I need to provide some context about who I am and what I do," Nathan said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone delivering prepared remarks to an important audience. "I'm the executive director of the Weston Family Foundation. We're Tennessee's second-largest private foundation, with an annual operating budget of $4.2 million. A ripple of interest moved through the room. Foundation work was serious business in Nashville society, the kind of responsibility that carried real influence and connected to every major charitable organization in the state. We fund crisis intervention programs, domestic violence prevention, mental health support, and emergency services across Tennessee, Nathan continued. It's work that requires careful evaluation of every organization we support, every program we fund, and every counselor we employ. I felt my heart start beating faster. Nathan was talking about foundation work, crisis intervention, counselors. He was building towards something that involved my professional world. Which brings me to Hope Haven Shelter, Nathan said, and I stopped breathing entirely. The silence in the room became absolute. Margaret Sterling straightened in her chair. Elizabeth Marsh leaned forward at table 6. Caroline's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching alarm. Hope Haven Shelter is one of 12 organizations that receive funding from the Weston Family Foundation. Last year, our contribution was $347,000, specifically designated for crisis intervention and emergency counseling services. Nathan paused, letting those numbers sink in. $347,000 was serious money, the kind of contribution that saved lives and funded entire programs. I read every quarterly report from every organization we fund, not because I have to, but because I believe in accountability for every dollar we invest in Tennessee communities. Last year, Nathan continued, his voice gaining strength and clarity, Hope Haven Shelter served 218 women in crisis. These weren't women making bad choices, as Caroline suggested. These were women fleeing domestic violence, women threatened with murder by intimate partners, women whose children were in immediate danger. The room was completely still. This wasn't wedding speech territory anymore. This was testimony about life and death. Hope Haven's crisis counselors handled 89 direct interventions last year. 89 phone calls from women in immediate danger, women calling from hospital beds, women hiding in closets while abusive partners broke down doors, women contemplating suicide because they couldn't see any other escape. I heard someone whisper Jesus under their breath. Wine glasses sat untouched on tables as guests absorbed information that was far more serious than they'd expected from a wedding reception. Amanda Callahan personally handled 67 of those 89 crisis calls, Nathan said, his eyes finding me at table 22. 67 women in the worst moments of their lives called Hope Haven's emergency hotline and got Amanda on the phone. Margaret Sterling turned to stare at me with an expression of complete shock. Dr. Patterson set down his fork and gave me his full attention for the first time all evening. Amanda has a 100% success rate, Nathan continued. Every woman who called her for help survived. Every intervention she handled resulted in a positive outcome. Every life she touched was saved. The silence stretched for 10 full seconds. I could hear my own heartbeat, the distant hum of air conditioning, the barely audible sound of someone crying softly at a table near the front. Caroline's face had gone completely white. When Caroline told me her sister was unwanted by anyone, I have to respectfully disagree, Nathan said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with perfect clarity. Amanda is wanted by 218 women who needed help and got it. She's wanted by 67 women who called a crisis line and found someone who cared enough to save their lives. 3 months ago, Nathan said, reaching into his jacket pocket and removing a folded document. Amanda received a call at 2:18 in the morning. A woman named Sarah was standing on the Shelby Street Bridge, ready to end her life. He unfolded the paper, an official document that looked like a police report. Metro Nashville police were dispatched to the scene. Their crisis negotiator was called, but Sarah would only talk to Amanda. Nathan held up the document so the room could see it was official, documented, real. For 47 minutes, Amanda talked to Sarah about her children, her reasons for living, her worth as a human being. The police report documents everything: the call duration, the intervention techniques, the successful outcome. He set the document on the podium. Sarah stepped back from the edge at 3:05 a.m. She's alive today because Amanda Callahan answered her phone in the middle of the night and refused to give up on a stranger. Elizabeth Marsh stood up from table 6, her face grave with recognition and respect. "I know this case," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "As Tennessee State Senator for District 20, I read every crisis intervention report that involves state resources. The Shelby Street Bridge incident is documented in our legislative files." She looked directly at my mother. "The woman you just called a used product saved a life that night, and it wasn't the first time." Nathan nodded his thanks to Elizabeth, then returned his attention to the 156 guests who were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment to something approaching awe. "So, when I hear Amanda described as a failure, as someone who makes bad choices, as someone who helps nobody important, I feel obligated to correct the record," Nathan said. "Amanda helps women whose society has written off. Women who've been called used products by people who should protect them. Women who've been told they're worthless by the very people who claim to love them." His voice hardened slightly. "And she saves their lives. One phone call at a time. One crisis intervention at a time. One woman at a time." But Nathan wasn't finished yet. The foundation revelation and the bridge documentation were just the beginning of what he had to tell this room full of people who'd just spent 10 minutes laughing at my expense. "Which brings me to tonight's announcement," he said, reaching into his other jacket pocket. The room held its collective breath, waiting for whatever revelation was coming next. "The Weston Family Foundation Board met last Thursday," Nathan said, removing a second folded document from his jacket pocket. "We voted unanimously to expand Hope Haven's crisis intervention program across Tennessee." He unfolded the document with deliberate care, holding it so the room could see official letterhead, signatures, legal formatting that indicated serious business was being conducted. "We're allocating $350,000 over the next 2 years for statewide expansion. 3 new satellite centers in rural Tennessee communities that currently have no crisis intervention services. A 24-hour hotline network covering areas where women have no access to help." I couldn't process what I was hearing. $350,000 for expansion, statewide program. Everything we'd talked about at Hope Haven but never imagined we could afford. "This expansion will serve an estimated 400 additional women annually. Rural communities where domestic violence happens behind closed doors, where women have nowhere to turn, where isolation enables abuse to continue unchecked." Nathan looked directly at me. "The board voted to name this program the Amanda Callahan Center Expansion Fund." The silence that followed was complete and profound. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Caroline's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the ballroom like a gunshot. "The woman you just called a used product," Nathan said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly to every corner of the room, "is having a $350,000 program named after her. A program that will save lives across Tennessee." Elizabeth Marsh stood up from table 6, walked to the microphone area, and asked Nathan with a gesture if she could speak. Nathan stepped aside immediately, recognizing her authority. "For those who don't know me," Elizabeth began, her voice carrying the practiced clarity of someone accustomed to addressing legislative chambers and public forums, "I'm Tennessee State Senator Elizabeth Marsh, representing District 20. I also serve on the advisory board of the Weston Family Foundation." My father's face went completely pale. Having a state senator at your daughter's wedding was impressive. Having that senator contradict your family's assessment of your other daughter was mortifying. "I can personally verify every word Nathan just said," Elizabeth continued, looking out at the silent room with the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years in public service. "I've read Amanda's case files. I've reviewed the police reports from her interventions. I've studied the statistics from Hope Haven Shelter." She turned to look directly at my mother. The Amanda Callahan Center Expansion Fund is not just a nice gesture, it has my full legislative support. I've already introduced a bill to provide matching state funds for crisis intervention programs in rural Tennessee. Elizabeth's voice carried the weight of political authority and moral conviction. This program will be operational within 6 months. It will save lives in communities where women currently have no options except to endure abuse or risk everything to escape it. She paused, letting the gravity of that statement settle over the room. The woman you called a used product is about to become the director of a program that will serve the entire state of Tennessee. The only sound in the ballroom was someone crying softly at table 14. Nathan returned to the microphone as Elizabeth walked back to table 6. Which brings me to the personal aspect of tonight's announcement, Nathan said, looking across 43 steps of marble floor to table 22, where I sat in my $89 Target dress, trying to absorb what was happening to my life. Amanda, he said, his voice warm but formal, carrying the weight of an official job offer being made in front of 156 witnesses, the Foundation Board has authorized me to offer you the position of Executive Director of the Amanda Callahan Center Expansion Fund. 156 people turned to stare at me. The silence was complete except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Starting salary, $72,000 annually, full benefits, administrative support, a staff of 12 crisis counselors across 3 locations. Nearly double my current salary, a chance to build something bigger than I'd ever imagined, the opportunity to save lives on a scale that went beyond individual phone calls and crisis interventions. The position starts Monday if you accept it, Nathan continued. We have offices ready, funding secured, legislative support confirmed. He paused. Amanda Callahan, will you accept the position of Executive Director? Every eye in the room was on me. Caroline looked like she might faint. My father appeared to be having trouble breathing. My mother sat perfectly still, her face drained of all color. Margaret Sterling whispered, "Good God," under her breath. I stood up slowly from table 22, smoothed my navy dress, and walked 43 steps across the marble floor toward the microphone. It was time for me to speak for myself. I walked from table 22 to the podium with as much dignity as I could manage. 43 steps across marble floor in my $45 Payless shoes, while 156 people watched my every move. My navy dress felt appropriate now, serious, professional, the uniform of someone about to accept a position of real responsibility. My modest heels clicked steadily against the marble, marking time like a metronome as I crossed the ballroom. I didn't look at Caroline. I didn't look at my parents. I kept my eyes focused on Nathan, who stepped aside as I reached the microphone and handed it to me with a slight nod of encouragement. When I adjusted the microphone to my height and looked out at the silent room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in my family's presence for 4 years. Complete confidence in my own worth. Thank you, Nathan, I said, my voice steady and clear. I accept the position. The relief in Nathan's expression was visible, and several guests began to applaud before I raised my hand to indicate I wasn't finished speaking. But before we celebrate, I need to address something that's been weighing on me tonight, I continued. The room fell silent again, sensing that the evening's surprises weren't over yet. Respect, I said, looking out at the faces of people who'd spent the evening laughing at my expense, isn't something you earn through the right job title, the right address, or the right last name. I let that statement settle for a moment. Respect is the minimum standard every human being deserves, not because of what they've achieved, but because they exist. Because they matter, because their lives have value. Margaret Sterling was nodding slowly. Several other guests had stopped avoiding eye contact and were actually listening to what I had to say. For 4 years, I've been treated like a failure because I'm a single mother, like damaged goods because my marriage ended, like someone to be hidden away at back tables and excluded from family celebrations. I gestured toward table 22 without looking away from the audience. Tonight, I sat 15 meters from my own family while they publicly discussed my failures as entertainment for your dinner conversation. The silence was uncomfortable now, charged with recognition that this had gone far beyond normal family teasing. But what you heard about my work, that's who I actually am. I save lives. I prevent suicides. I help women escape situations that could kill them. I answer my phone at 2:18 in the morning because someone needs to know they're not alone. My voice remained steady throughout, but I could feel the emotion building behind my words. I'll be moving to Nashville to start this program, I announced. Lily and I will be building a life there, working to expand crisis intervention services across Tennessee. I looked directly at my parents for the first time since taking the microphone. I won't be attending family events anymore. Not until respect becomes the baseline instead of something I have to earn through your approval. The silence stretched for 15 seconds. I could hear individual heartbeats, individual breaths, the barely audible sound of someone shifting in their chair. Thank you for your time, I said simply. I handed the microphone back to Nathan, walked 43 steps back across the marble floor, collected my purse from table 22, and headed toward the exit. I didn't stop to hug my parents goodbye. I didn't congratulate Caroline on her wedding. I didn't thank anyone for the lovely evening. I walked out of the grand ballroom with my head high and my future finally in my own hands. I sat in my Honda Civic in the Brentwood Country Club parking lot for exactly 5 minutes, letting the magnitude of what had just happened settle into my consciousness. The engine ticked as it cooled. The dashboard clock read 8:45 p.m. In the space of 20 minutes, my sister's wedding had transformed into my professional vindication. My family's humiliation had become my career breakthrough, and the used product had been offered a $72,000 salary to direct a program bearing her own name. The 23-minute drive home gave me time to process the surreal shift from public embarrassment to public honor. By the time I reached my apartment complex, my phone was already ringing with unknown numbers, probably reporters, foundation board members, or politicians who'd been at the wedding and wanted to follow up on the evening's unexpected revelations. I picked up Lily from Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment. She was asleep on the couch, curled up with her favorite stuffed elephant, wearing purple pajamas that were getting too small for her growing 7-year-old body. Mija got a new job tonight, I whispered to Mrs. Rodriguez as I gathered Lily's things. A really important one. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled and squeezed my hand. Good for you, honey. About time someone recognized what you do. I carried Lily to our car, buckled her into her booster seat, and whispered, Mommy got a promotion, baby. We're going to help even more crying ladies now. Lily mumbled something about helping people and fell back asleep against the car seat. Monday, October 21st, 9 a.m. I walked into the Weston Family Foundation offices in downtown Nashville, wearing a black blazer I'd bought on Sunday, my hair styled professionally, carrying a briefcase that contained exactly 3 items: a legal pad, 2 pens, and a printed copy of the bridge incident report that had started everything. My new office was on the 3rd floor, with windows overlooking Music Row and a brass nameplate that read, Amanda Callahan, Executive Director, Crisis Intervention Expansion Program. 15 staff members were waiting for our first team meeting. 3 locations to establish, 400 additional women to serve annually, a statewide network to build from the ground up. My starting salary, $72,000 annually. Nearly double my previous income, enough to move Lily and me into a better neighborhood, enough to start her college fund properly, enough to live without the constant financial stress that had defined our lives for 4 years. But more than the money was the recognition, the acknowledgement that the work I'd been doing mattered, that the women I helped were valuable, that saving lives was worth celebrating instead of hiding. At 11:30 a.m., Nathan stopped by my office to check how the transition was going. How does it feel? He asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. Like I'm exactly where I belong, I replied, and meant it completely. Sarah calls every month, you know, Nathan said with a slight smile. She always asks about the counselor who saved her life. What should I tell her when she calls next week? Tell her that Amanda Callahan is doing exactly what she was meant to do. Nathan nodded and left me alone in my office, where I spent the rest of the day planning a program that would save lives across Tennessee. I'd been called a used product by my own mother. I'd been hidden at the back table by my own sister. I'd been treated like a failure by my own father. But the women who called our crisis line knew the truth. Sarah knew the truth. The 218 women we'd helped last year knew the truth. Respect isn't something you earn. It's the minimum every human being deserves. And sometimes, the people who understand that best are the ones who've been denied it the longest. My name is Amanda Callahan. I'm 33 years old. I save lives for a living. And that's exactly who I was meant to be.